lifting up Jesus, opening his word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV. Hi, this is Tim Worth with Moriel TV. I'm here live with James Jacob Prasch, and Jacob is live in England. And Jacob, there's a big debate these days. Does faith in God and science contradict each other?
Thank you for your question. This question has been answered in many ways by many different people, and I've answered it several times in several different formats. Science, properly understood, and scripture, properly interpreted, do not contradict each other. There may be areas of non-contact, but there's no areas of mutual exclusivity where one can only be true and the other therefore must be false. This idea of juxtaposing faith against scientific fact is the invention of Darwinists. But let's look at Darwinists. There are many things in science, certainly in particle physics, certainly in molecular biology, many things, but most particularly in particle physics and molecular biology, that we know to be true by effect, but we do not understand how they work. One of the games Darwinists will play is saying, scientific method means you have to be able to conduct an experiment and get a result, and a repeated result, and then someone else somewhere else has to do the same experiment under the same conditions and get the same result for it to be scientifically factual. Therefore, because evolution cannot do this, because creationism cannot do this, it's not scientifically factual. Neither can creationism do this. That's their first problem. Neither can creationism do this. I'd like to see anybody create something ex nihilo. Neither can creationism do this. Neither can something evolve out of nothing without a pre-existing program. Let's look, first of all, at the scientific fact of the matter. As I pointed out a number of times, in the age of Charles Darwin, from Shrewsbury, England, Darwin's age, there was no such thing as information science. Information science was essentially existing embryonically in the 1940s. It was in its infancy in the 1950s. It was a baby in the 1960s. In the 1970s and 80s, it began growing into adolescence. Now, much of the world in science, technology, and economy runs on information science. We live in an information age. Let's take any faculty in any major university with a science-based curriculum, known for science, Berkeley, or Stanford, or MIT, or Imperial College London, any of the major scientific universities. If you went into a faculty of information science, those professors would tell you there is no such thing as auto-encryption. Information cannot come from a vacuum. There must be a pre-existing intelligence if you had a code. There is no auto-encryption. When you have sophisticated coding, there had to be a pre-existing intelligence to write the code. We do have software programs today that can algorithmically write other software programs. That is true. But somebody still had to write the master program first. Information cannot come from a vacuum. Coding requires a pre-existing intelligence. These companies like Microsoft and Facebook, social media, Google, all of them, are recruiting graduate students from the Far East because they're good in mathematics and computer science to come work in Silicon Valley because because they know how to code, because they're intelligent people who know codification and understand algorithmic mathematics. My wife teaches algorithms. Quite a thing she does. She teaches algorithmic math to children who are socially handicapped, but who are mathematically brilliant. Her students are Asperger's children, have Asperger's syndromes, and autistic children who are mathematically exceptionally gifted, just that they're socially handicapped. Highly intelligent in that narrow sphere. Information cannot come from a vacuum. It just doesn't happen. And now let's walk across the campus into the Faculty of Biomedical Sciences. Those professors will tell you there is auto-encryption. The human genome alone, just the human genome, has 13 billion lines of coded information of nucleotide sequencing of the 4 basic nucleotides. There's a separate one in recombinant in RNA. Recombinance depends on it. This happened by chance. It came from nothing. Well, information science says that's impossible. You have a conflict between information science and the old Darwinism. What you have today is the following, if you can understand how I'm explaining it. Darwinism was the pseudo-scientific basis of Hegelian philosophy. The thesis, the antithesis or antithesis, and the synthesis, adopted by Karl Marx. Marx said that capitalism evolved from feudalism, so communism will evolve from capitalism. He said because England was the first capitalist country, or Great Britain was the first capitalist country, communist revolution will begin in Britain. It wouldn't work in Russia because Russia is still feudal. Well, Marx was fundamentally proved wrong. Communism didn't begin in the first capitalist country. It began in the last feudal country, Russia, under the Tsars. Why was he wrong? Because Hegelian philosophy was wrong. Why is Hegel's philosophy wrong? It's called dialectics. Because Darwinism is wrong. Its pseudo-scientific pretense is bogus. You see the same thing in higher criticism. Liberal scholars would like to say, well, the texts of the Old and New Testament today evolved over a period of centuries. We don't know what the original ones were like. There's a big difference between the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of history. And there's Deutero-Isaiah and Trito-Isaiah. We don't know what these originals look like and how they evolved, like beads on a string from oral traditions. They said they were following the same Hegelian model. These things evolved. But then we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. Fundamentally mitigates against their presupposition. These things did not mutate. Jewish scholars, non-Christians with no pro-Christian bias, Jewish scholars, Orthodox Jewish rabbis who are academics, people like Pinchas Lapid, Dr. Pinchas Lapid, Bar-Ilan University, or Professor Jacob Neusner, Professor Emeritus, Brown University, Ivy League. Many, Dr. David Flusser, Hebrew University. They've looked at the New Testament with a Jewish eye and said, these teachings of Jesus and the gospel could not possibly have been written by a Gentile church centuries later. They did not evolve. These are Second Temple period Jewish literature writings. They have to come from the Sitzim Leben of first century Judaism. These are Jewish scholars with no pro-Christian prejudice. Why? Because Hegelian dialectic is wrong. These texts didn't evolve. Why? Because its underlying scientific pretense, Darwinism, is rubbish. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, you had the ridiculous old men in the Kremlin still teaching Marxism, dialectic materialism, things that they knew didn't work. It was falling to pieces, but they still pretended it had substance. Liberal scholars are doing the same thing. They're still trying to propagate debunked nonsense like Wellhausen's theory of Pentateuchal sources and things that liberal scholars believe. things that are nonsense with no evidence, and with evidence to the contrary, yet they're holding on to it because they built their careers on a lie, the same as the old men in the Kremlin built their careers on a lie. Well, Darwinism is the same thing. They built their careers on a lie. Information science says it's rubbish. But something else has happened now. Because of biogenetic engineering, people are going to think that they can control evolution. But that means man will be deified instead of God, but it also means there's a pre-existing intelligence to adjust the coding. There is no transmutation of nucleic acids across the genus barrier in the natural environment. It just doesn't happen. The DNA of a zebra will not become the DNA of a lobster, and that will not become the DNA of a poinsettia plant. Only with biogenetic engineering can we begin to do this, raising the caveat of what the scripture says about, again, mixing the seed. We've talked about these things before. The prohibition against mixing the seed in the Torah, the Pentateuch. But let's look at this now. It's falling to pieces. Because biogenetic engineering is a reality now, Darwinism is under assault, even within the scientific community, without any references to Judaism or Christianity. At the same time, it's under assault from information science. It's nonsense. You've got entrenched interests who built their careers on a nonsense, not wanting to admit it's a nonsense, because all the books will have to be rewritten. Well, the books are going to have to be rewritten. Darwinism has been consistently inconsistent. Going back to Jean-Paul Lamarck, ontogeny is the recapitulation of phylogeny, that a species will embryonically evolve up to its level on the phylogenetic scale. These things are crazy. They're all disproven. Nonetheless, people still try to make it to be a scientific fact. Now, I don't believe in the genetic inferior of homosexuals. I do not believe they are genetically inferior. But if I was a Darwinist, I'd have to say they were. I don't believe people are born homosexual or lesbian. Rare cases of hermaphrodites, some kind of an argument could be made anatomically, but even there, you've got X and Y chromosomes. They're either chromosomally male or female. I don't believe people are born homosexual. There's absolutely zero evidence for it, and plenty of evidence against it. However, if I believed people were born homosexual and I was a Darwinist, that would mean homosexuals and lesbians are genetically inferior. Why? Survival of the fittest. Because they can't reproduce, they're genetically inferior. It's a birth defect, if I was a Darwinist. Why save the whale? Why protect endangered species? They're not supposed to survive in a Darwinistic world. The contradictions between these idiots, the pseudo-academic idiocracy of the Darwinists, is unbelievable. They can't cogently or rationally justify their own values. Jonas Salk, developer of poliomyelitis, the vaccine, poliomyelitis, he admitted this. He said there's a contradiction that he's looking for the cure for diseases when his Darwinistic worldview tells him that these diseases are supposed to kill people off who can't survive. He admitted it on a TV interview. There is no transmutation of nucleic acids across the genus barrier in the natural environment. None. People have tried to look at the becones, a kind of a substance that is a synthetic, that there is indeed a human protein capable of catabolizing. So their argument is, well, therefore, since this is a synthetic substance and it can be catabolized enzymatically, therefore the enzyme had to evolve. That's like putting a reflector on the back of a bicycle and saying the rest of the bicycle evolved because of a reflector. There was just something in the genome to begin with that was capable of catabolizing that particular substance. It's breaking down its molecular configuration and dispersing its bonds. That's all that means. They extrapolate all these fanciful theories out of nonsense. There is one case where you can have the transmutation of nucleic acids across the genus barrier. It works with the bacteriophage. Bacteriophage is where a virus attaches itself to a bacteria. It can extract nucleic acids from the cytoplasm of a host cell, detach and reattach to another cell, and inject those nucleic acids into the cytoplasm of the second cell. But that always destroys the second cell. Entropy, bioentropy kicks in. Entropy says things don't go from a state of disorder to order. Entropy says things go from order to disorder. It works to the detriment. Even where it happens, it works to the detriment, not to the evolution of any organism or a microorganism. It just doesn't happen. The whole thing is nonsense. If I was to say, well, because you can't prove it, therefore it's not scientific. Particle physicists have been talking ages about a fifth force in addition to strong force, weak force, gravity, and electromagnetism. They've said there's a fifth force because we can't account for the amount of matter in the universe. They've been saying this for years. They're postulating things like superstring theory and critical universe theory. Now we know that light particles have come across the event horizon out of the black holes. But what we believed about those black holes, that light couldn't escape, was proven false, yet it was almost held as a fact. These people are scientifically inconsistent with science themselves. What it basically comes to is this. Well, okay, if there has to be a pre-existing intelligence to write a code, that would mean there must be a creator. And we can't say that. It's not politically correct. Wait a minute. We didn't mention creator. We just said a pre-existing intelligence. Intelligent design. No, you can't say that because that can lead people to believe there's a God. Let the evidence take us where it may. Be scientific about it. There's nobody more unscientific in their methodology or in their presuppositions than Darwinists. Now let's go even further with this. There was something called teleomny. You do have the capacity of biological systems, of tumbleweed, of all kinds of things, plant life, to take chaotic matter that is genetically jumbled and to turn it into something structurally ordered. That seems to go against the second law of thermodynamics. However, it requires genetic coding, which requires a pre-existing intelligence for that effect to happen. Their whole world is nonsense. No. Real science cannot coexist with bogus science. Darwinism cannot coexist with information science. Darwinism cannot coexist with science and scientific reality and scientific fact. Creationism certainly can. Cause and effect. Information does not come from a vacuum. The F-22 fighter bomber has approximately 8 million lines of coded information in its computer systems. That plane is basically a flying computer. 8 million lines of data in its program. 8 million. Huge. But again, the human genome has 13 billion. And it has to function in a biosphere where you have the kangaroo genome, and where you have the parakeet genome, and where you have the maple tree genome. It's absolutely absurd to think that anything, even remotely, even conceptually approaching the coded complexity of the nucleic acid makeup of the biosphere of the Earth could evolve out of nothing. It's not only unscientific, It is totally, totally stupid. Now look, there is good creation science and there is bad creation science. A good creationist or a good creation scientist is either a scientist who has been theologically trained and biblically literate, or a Bible expositor or theologian who's been scientifically trained and is scientifically literate. There are good creationists and there are creationists who are not so good. There is good creation science and there is bad creation science. There is, however, no good Darwinism. It's not even real science. It's all rubbish. Who says so? The Word of God? Science says so. It just does not stand up to scientific methodology. You're a Darwinist? If you're a real Darwinist, you don't believe in saving the whale. I do. God put man on the earth to take care of it, it says in Genesis. If you're a real Darwinist, you think homosexuals have a birth defect because they can't reproduce. I don't. I think it's morally wrong, but I don't think they're genetically inferior. Darwinism would say that black people are genetically inferior to white people and to Asians. I don't believe that. But if I was a Darwinist, I would have to. It is a pseudo-scientific basis for racism. In fact, Hitler and the Japanese imperialists took such things to their natural conclusions. Remember, the two biggest killers of all time, Hitler and Stalin, were both socialists, but they were both Darwinists. That ought to tell us something right there. My name is Jacob Prasch. God bless.
And Jacob, just to expound a slight bit on that, do you think the gap theory was created in order to accommodate the errors of carbon-14 dating?
First of all, carbon-14 dating is based again on a presuppositional science that particle degeneration and carbon particle emission has always taken place now, has always taken place at the rate it presently does. The scriptures tell us that there were fundamental changes to the biosphere with both the fall of man in Genesis 3 and with the flood, with the Diluvian age. Antediluvian man before Noah lived in a different biosphere than we did, and Adam lived in a different one prior to that. Entropy, and carbon-14 is simply an expression of entropy, has not always taken place at the same rate it does now. Because of sin, not only death came into the world, but the rate of death increased. Antediluvian man, these people really did live to be hundreds of years old. It's just that there was a genetic corruption that made people die faster. Now, in the millennial reign of Christ, where it says that somebody dying at the age of 120 will be a pediatric fatality, the earth is going to go back to that, to the longevity of Methuselah, who lived to be nearly 1,000 years. It's going to revert to that. Carbon-14 is simply an expression of entropy. But entropy has not always happened at the same rate now, the same rate then as it does now. That's its first problem. You've got to assume that the decay always took place at the same rate. The scriptures tells us it didn't. And there are other things that tell us that rates of entropy can increase. Some, again, astrophysicists believe there's a light entropy, and that c, the speed of light, the velocity of light is only a relative constant, but that's another issue. It's debated, of course, but it's another issue. Entropy has not always taken place at the same rate. Additionally, there have been admitted miscalculations in carbon-14 dating. They have given incredible ages to animals who were known to be younger, and all kinds of things like this. When Mount St. Helens blew up in the United States, in our lifetime, or lifetime of many of us, something happened. Acid-activated water, acid-activated water was able to turn decayed wood into coal. I think it was bituminous. It may have been anthracite. I'm not sure. I think it was anthracite. Sorry. John Mackay would be the person to ask. Who's a mineral geologist, who was a creationist. But this happened in 18 months. Organic matter was turned into coal, fossil fuel, in 18 months by activation of water, mere water that had become acidic. Again, carbon-14 dating is highly presuppositional. To say that coal, the earth must be this age because of the decayed vegetable matter and the organic breakdown and the reconfiguration of the carbon molecules into a coal, into hard coal or anthracite or soft coal, bituminous, would have taken this many millions of years or whatever. It's happened overnight with Mount St. Helens. You've got to take on board their presuppositions. They're not taking these presuppositions and merely using them as a working hypothesis. That's only the interim step. They treat these things as fact. They treat these things as fact. Because science treats something as fact doesn't mean it's scientifically true. Barbers used to practice bloodletting in the Middle Ages, and that was medical science. It was crazy. From the time of Aristotle onward, human circulation was understood by studying the cardiovascular anatomy of a pig, all the way up until the time of William Harvey. That's how cardiovascular medicine and anatomy was taught. Because something is claimed to be scientific and science accepts it, later science can debunk it. Nowhere has that been more true than in Darwinism. Darwinism has to go back and revising and revisioning into revisionism because its own premises keep collapsing in the face of progress and in the expansion of knowledge in genetic science. It just can't stand up. They've got to keep going back and revising it. It's just the way it is.
Thank you, Jacob. Very good answers.